Some people don't shrink because they are unsure of themselves. They shrink because they have learned something others haven't. In almost every social space, in offices, in families, in friendships, even in quiet partnerships, there is often someone who feels more capable than they appear. They listen more than they speak. They hesitate before offering solutions they already understand. They let others arrive at conclusions they could have provided much earlier. And from the outside, this behavior looks like hesitation. But inside, it is not hesitation. It is awareness. Because over time, intelligent people begin to notice a pattern that is rarely spoken about openly. Visibility creates friction, not because ability is wrong, but because ability disrupts emotional equilibrium. Every group carries an invisible structure, not just roles, but emotional balance. Someone is expected to lead. Someone is expected to struggle. Someone is expected to guide. Someone is expected to follow. And when a person steps beyond the role quietly assigned to them, tension appears. It is rarely loud. It appears in small reactions. A pause, a subtle defensiveness, a shift in tone, a change in trust. And over time, the observant mind begins to connect these moments. They notice that competence does not always produce appreciation. Sometimes it produces discomfort. Sometimes it produces resistance. Sometimes it produces distance. So something begins to change. Instead of always demonstrating what they know, they begin to measure the emotional cost of being right. Instead of correcting every flawed assumption, they begin to weigh the relational impact of clarity. Instead of asserting strength in every situation, they begin to ask a quieter question. Is this the moment where showing full capability helps or harms? Because in many environments, standing out shifts dynamics that others depend on for stability. And people protect stability. Even when stability is built on illusion, a person who speaks too clearly can accidentally threaten someone who relies on ambiguity. A person who acts too decisively can unsettle someone who depends on hesitation. A person who sees patterns too quickly can disrupt those who need gradual understanding to feel secure. So intelligence learns restraint, not as submission, but as navigation. This is how the obedient shadow begins to form. It does not begin with fear. It begins with observation. Perhaps someone once spoke confidently and was met with subtle resentment. Perhaps they offered a solution too early and were told they were overthinking. Perhaps they corrected an error and were quietly excluded afterward. These moments accumulate, and they teach a lesson that no classroom explains. Being right is not always socially safe. In childhood, intelligence is often praised. In adulthood, it becomes political. Because the moment someone demonstrates unusual clarity, they become more than an individual. They become a comparison, and comparison generates tension. People rarely dislike intelligence itself. They dislike how intelligence makes them feel about themselves. So the intelligent person begins to adapt. They soften, they delay. They sometimes allow misunderstandings to pass. Not because they are incapable of correction, but because they recognize the cost of correction may exceed its benefit. This adjustment appears in subtle ways. A person who knows the solution may wait for others to propose it. A person who understands the risk may allow others to discover it gradually. A person who sees the emotional direction of a conversation may let it unfold without interruption. To observers, this looks passive. To the individual, it feels strategic. Because the intelligent mind begins to notice something else. Recognition changes expectations. The moment you are seen as capable, you are asked to perform. The moment you are seen as strong, you are expected to carry. The moment you are seen as wise, you are expected to resolve. And with expectation comes obligation. So remaining slightly underestimated preserves flexibility. It allows a person to choose when to engage, rather than being summoned automatically. In professional environments, this might mean offering insight in stages rather than all at once, allowing others to feel ownership of ideas, avoiding unnecessary displays of competence, not out of dishonesty, but out of social efficiency. Because influence often grows more easily, when it does not threaten identity. In friendships, it might mean letting others tell stories without correction, allowing opinions to exist without challenge, choosing connection over accuracy. Because relationships are not sustained by precision, they are sustained by emotional comfort. And in intimate relationships, it may appear as holding clarity instead of delivering it, choosing timing over immediacy, letting someone arrive at realization rather than forcing it. Because truth delivered too quickly can feel like attack, and truth delivered too slowly can feel like care. Over time, this becomes less conscious. The intelligent person begins to modulate presence naturally. They speak when the room is ready. They lead when resistance is low. They reveal when trust is stable. And they remain quiet when expression would generate more noise than progress. This does not mean they disappear. It means they select visibility. And selection is power, because constant visibility invites scrutiny, but selective visibility invites influence. The obedient shadow is not about weakness. It is about pacing, not about hiding, but about understanding that being fully expressed at all times is not always effective. There are environments where strength must arrive gradually, where clarity must unfold slowly, where presence must feel safe before it feels impressive. This becomes especially important in emotionally structured spaces. Many people build identity around being the helper, the decision maker, the experienced one, the strong one. When someone else enters and unintentionally challenges these roles, even through competence alone, defensiveness can appear. Not because harm was intended, but because identity feels threatened. So instead of confronting identity, the obedient shadow coexists with it. It allows others to maintain their self-image while subtly shaping outcomes. It avoids unnecessary collisions, and by avoiding collisions, it preserves access. Access to dialogue, access to trust, access to change. Because influence without access is ineffective. And access often depends on emotional safety. So the intelligent person sometimes steps back, not to surrender, but to keep the door open. The deeper shift happens internally. They stop asking, "How do I prove what I know?" and begin asking, "How do I move without resistance?" And this question transforms behavior, because proving creates opposition. Movement creates direction. The obedient shadow becomes less about concealment and more about alignment. Aligning expression with readiness, aligning clarity with openness, aligning leadership with acceptance. And through this alignment, something quiet emerges. Freedom. Freedom from constant performance. Freedom from expectation. Freedom from being assigned roles they did not choose. But this adaptation is not without complexity, because over time, restraint can become habit, and habit can become identity. A person who frequently moderates themselves may begin to wonder, where does adjustment end and self-limitation begin? This question marks the edge of the shadow, and understanding that edge requires deeper reflection. The obedient shadow is not only a social strategy, it becomes an internal negotiation, because once someone learns how to reduce friction by softening their presence, the habit begins to extend beyond situations where it was originally useful. At first, restraint is chosen consciously. Later, it becomes automatic, and eventually, it can feel like the safest default state. A person may begin to hold back even when the room is ready. They may hesitate even when leadership is needed. They may remain quiet even when clarity would help, not because the environment demands it, but because the pattern has become familiar, and familiarity feels safe. This is where the shadow begins to blur. Originally, it was a tool, a way to navigate emotionally complex environments. But if it remains unexamined, it can slowly shape identity. The individual may start to wonder, do I choose when to be small? Or has being small begun to choose me? Because restraint protects, but it also limits. Being underestimated creates freedom from pressure, but it can also create distance from recognition. Remaining unseen preserves flexibility, but it can also delay opportunity. Softening influence avoids resistance, but it can also reduce impact. So the intelligent person eventually faces a quiet turning point, not in public, but internally. They begin to ask, when is shrinking wise? And when is it avoidance? When does patience become hesitation? When does diplomacy become silence? When does adaptability become self-erasure? This distinction matters, because while the obedient shadow is a survival posture, it is not meant to be permanent. It is situational. And like any situational response, it must remain flexible. Otherwise, it risks becoming a limitation rather than a strength. The reason many intelligent people fall into this pattern deeply is emotional, not intellectual. It is tied to belonging. Humans do not only seek effectiveness, they seek connection. And connection often depends on emotional harmony. When someone consistently disrupts that harmony, even through correctness, they may find themselves isolated. So adaptation feels necessary. But over time, the cost of constant adaptation becomes visible. A person may feel underutilized, misunderstood, unseen, not because they lack ability, but because their ability has remained partially concealed. This is the paradox. The same behavior that preserves stability begins to restrict expression. And expression is not only about recognition, it is about authenticity, the ability to act in alignment with what one sees and understands. So the mature form of the obedient shadow is not permanent invisibility. It is selective emergence, knowing when to remain quiet, and knowing when silence no longer serves, knowing when harmony matters, and knowing when clarity matters more. Because influence without presence eventually fades, and presence without timing invites resistance. So balance becomes essential. In practical terms, this might appear as allowing others to lead when leadership is already stable, but stepping forward when confusion creates harm, remaining adaptable in casual settings, but asserting clarity when decisions carry consequence, softening expression in emotionally fragile moments, but speaking firmly when integrity is at risk. The shift is subtle. It is not about becoming louder. It is about becoming deliberate, no longer shrinking by default, but choosing when shrinking serves a purpose. And this awareness changes relationships. People begin to sense consistency. They notice that silence is no longer automatic. They feel that restraint is intentional rather than passive. And this increases respect, because presence that emerges by choice carries weight. This also changes self-perception. The individual no longer feels defined by restraint. They feel capable of both emergence and withdrawal. They understand that visibility is not a threat when chosen, and invisibility is not weakness when strategic. Over time, the question evolves. It is no longer, how do I avoid resistance? But, how do I move effectively within resistance? Because growth requires friction, and clarity sometimes invites discomfort. The obedient shadow, in its mature form, becomes less about hiding intelligence and more about pacing it, not suppressing insight, but sequencing it, not denying strength, but timing its expression. This understanding creates a new form of stability. The person no longer depends on being underestimated to feel safe. They can be seen without feeling trapped. They can lead without feeling burdened. They can speak without fearing rejection, because the shadow is no longer their identity. It is simply one posture among many. And this is the quiet evolution, from shrinking for survival to adjusting for effectiveness, from silence as protection to silence as choice, from invisibility as safety to visibility as intention. In the end, the obedient shadow reveals something essential. Power is not always loud, but neither is it always hidden. True stability lies in the ability to shift, to know when presence serves and when absence preserves, because being underestimated can create freedom, but being understood creates alignment, and alignment allows both influence and authenticity to coexist. The goal is not to abandon the shadow, but to ensure it remains a tool, not a prison. Some moments require restraint, some require clarity, some require patience, some require leadership. And wisdom lies in recognizing the difference, because intelligence is not measured by how often it appears, but by how precisely it arrives. Power does not always step forward. Sometimes it waits until the moment when stepping forward changes everything. And when that moment comes, the shadow does not disappear, it simply moves aside.